Hello, this is Gregg Ellis from Catch the Fire Church in Orlando, Florida, in the United States. And we're here talking about keys to revival. In this episode, what we're going to talk about is the eternal flame burning. It's very important to keep the fires of revival hot and burning, never letting the flame be extinguished. So once revival begins to birth within your city, within your organization, you want to make sure that you do everything you can to keep that flame burning. Keep it hot. Keep it hot. So I think the Lord is calling each one of us to, as we get set ablaze, as we start to burn with the passion of Jesus Christ in our hearts, that remnant from the Lord, that we keep that fire burning, we keep it stoked up. And as we were talking about in previous episodes about how it's important for us to encourage one another, and that's so vital in our lives when we see others faltering and when we see others where maybe they're not burning as hot, is to stir up the flame within them. But we need to stir up the flame in our own hearts too, in our own lives. There's a commonly known Native American tribe in the United States called the Cherokee Nation. Some of you may be familiar with them. And they have a story of the origin of fire and how this fire, before the fire, the world was cold and it was dark. And I think spiritually we can relate to that, where there's many times where you walk into an area in our world where it's cold and dark spiritually. But there was a lightning that came from the heavenly beings, and it struck a great hollow sycamore tree. Now this is the discussions that the Cherokee Nation have from ancient times, and we just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for that. I know if you're not familiar with the sycamore tree is very large. I remember when I was a young boy, there was a sycamore tree that had been struck by lightning at my grandmother's home. And as a small boy, my brothers and my sisters and my cousins, we would all gather together. And where the lightning had struck the tree, it had burned out the inside of the tree, and the outside of the tree was still whole. And so we could actually crawl into the tree and be actually surrounded inside the tree. You could see the black all around on the interior where the lightning had struck and burnt out the inside. That was where the fire was birthed forth. So the Cherokee Nation has this ancient story that they tell their young ones about the origin of fire. But we know that the origin of fire, the fiery presence of God, came directly from heaven. And God has something to say about the fire of his presence as well. In Leviticus chapter 6, beginning at verse 12, God was commanding Moses, giving some various requirements for the temple and for the temple worship. And in Leviticus chapter 6, verse 12, it talks about the fire. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest, and you believers, you're the royal priesthood and a holy nation, so the Lord is talking to you as well. It says in here, it must not go out. Every morning, the priest, that would be you, add firewood and arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. In verse 13, it says, the fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously, and it must not go out. This is what the Lord was commanding Moses. And the fire is not only speaking in the natural in the case of Moses, but it's a representative of the things in the heavenlies and what God is looking from our own hearts, that the fire within us will burn continuously. And every morning that we get up, we stoke that fire. We stoke that fire by arranging I think in this case where he's talking about arranging the firewood and the burnt offerings, you're thinking about your sacrifice when you get up early in the morning before you go to work, and you open up your Bible and you arrange it, and you got your prayer list arranged, and you begin to seek the Lord. You begin to stir up the fire that's within you. Stir up before you even go out on a daily basis, to stir up that fire so that things during the day don't snuff the fire out. Because the command there is don't let the fire go out. Keep the fire burning on the altar continuously. Scriptures speak a lot about the fire of God. If you look back in the days of Abraham, when the Lord was cutting a covenant with Abraham, where Abraham he separated the bull into two halves, and so he walked between those, that he was entering into a covenant with God. And it says in there when it became night that there was a censer of fire. That censer of fire passed between the two halves of the bull. All right, censer of fire representing the presence of God. Literally, the presence of God passed through between the bull as the covenant was being cut between Abraham and the Lord Himself. Moses encountered the fiery presence of God in the burning bush. He came and found that the fire was not consumed. It was a continuous fire. The fire also, in the fiery furnace where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown into the furnace. It was hotter, 7 times hotter than normal. But when they were entered into the furnace, when they were thrown into the furnace, something amazing happened. There was a greater fire that actually invaded that furnace, that was greater than the natural fire that was there. And that was a fiery presence of Jesus Christ. Because when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fire and he saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he noticed that there was a 4th person in there. And so the fiery presence of God was so strong in that furnace that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego exited the furnace, you couldn't even smell smoke on them, because God's fiery presence was greater than any earthly fire. There's the fiery presence of God that led the children of Israel through the desert. It says in Exodus chapter 24, verse 17, God is like a consuming fire. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Old Testament and all of these symbolisms of the fiery presence of God. But even in the New Testament, if you look in Luke chapter 3, John, as he's baptizing Jesus, before that in Luke chapter 3, verse 16, John the baptizer, he says, I baptize with water, but one more powerful than I is coming afterwards, and He will baptize you with Holy Spirit and with fire. What other opportunities do we see in the New Testament about fiery presence of God? Well, in the upper room. God did just that. He did just exactly what John the Baptist was actually speaking about. And God's fiery presence and His power was dumped into the room, in the upper room on that day where the 120 had gathered together. It's interesting that people that understand the fiery presence of God and the anointing and the power and presence of God, there's many times that they'll actually physically get the physical sensation of heat and burning. I know that Michael Koulianis, he's the son-in-law of Benny Hinn. They have a large ministry there in Orlando, and they have conferences several times a year. And I've heard it said that he tells his staff, I want you guys to turn the temperature way down in the room. I want it to be really cold. And it's true. When you go in, I mean, we're in Florida. It's quite warm in Florida. But you go into one of these conferences, you have to bring a coat because it's so cold. And it was said that the reason why Michael Koulianis likes it so cold is because he wants to know when the presence of God shows up and makes a physical manifestation in the room. Why? because he recognizes the fiery presence of God. And he says, I don't want to mistake that for me being physically hot. I find that to be quite amusing, that he makes it really cold just so that he knows when the fiery presence of God shows up in the room. A number of years ago when we were here, we came in the late winter, early springtime. I think it was around 2018, I believe it was. There was a mighty move everywhere we went. The fiery presence of God and was with us, and there was meetings that we were having around the city. Literally, the essence of revival, I could sense it in the air. It was so strong. I could walk through the streets, and it was like almost a tangible presence of revival was just brewing. And I feel like that God is really wanting to see more and more of people come to know him and to experience his love and his grace and his mercy around this city. And when when his presence gets so thick, you can almost tangibly feel that. And so every meeting that we went to, God's presence began to break out into the atmosphere in a physical way. I know we were at one meeting, and one of my friends, Kjell, we're worshiping the Lord. We're having revival. We're talking about revival, and all of a sudden, the heat in the room started increasing. And I'm thinking, well, maybe we put too much firewood on the fireplace, or maybe they opened up the vent or something. We weren't sure, but I was getting so hot. Now, I'd had a little bit of a cold, so in my personal, as I'm speaking, I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm reacting. Maybe I'm having having a fever or something. At the same moment, I'm having that thought. I'm looking at the ladies on the front row, and all of them start waving their hands like it's getting hot in here. And they start taking their sweaters off. It's getting that hot. And so everyone in the room it started spreading like wildfire, if you will. It was like the heat and the presence of God started increasing so powerfully in the room. God wanted to move. He wanted to see people transformed. He wanted to see lives set free. And all of a sudden, as his presence started to move in the room, there were individuals that the Lord began to touch them, and they began to weep, and they began to cry, and they began to pray, and the Lord began to touch their lives in areas of their lives where they had been damaged and they needed healing, whether it was emotional healing or physical healing. And we even had, it was at a home church. We were actually in a home, and we're kind of in their living room area, and the presence of God started falling out into the kitchen. There would be people that would come in that had come into the meeting late, and the power and the presence would hit them and knock them on the floor. The thing that was interesting is there was individuals in Florida that were prophesying and praying over the services before we came here to Finland. And one of the ladies, she says, I see the presence of God stirring. And I see as he's stirring, it's almost like a hurricane. And as that storm is brewing, it's moving over the face of Finland. It's moving over and it's focusing in on Helsinki area and region. And she says, and I see that the power and the presence will be so strong and so thick there that people will literally fall out in the presence of God in the snow. Now, I'm sitting there, wow, okay, that's an interesting word. And this happened before we left. So at this very meeting, as the presence of God and the heat of God started to rise within the room, one of the individuals, Kjell, he goes to open the door because he wants to cool the room down. And as soon as he opens the door, the presence of God hit him, knocked him on the ground. Now he's laid out between the door and the outside, and he's literally laying out in the snow. God's power and God's presence was that powerful. I remembered we began to pray for each other, and there were people that were seated in rows, kind of like in a church service, even though it was in a home. They had set up the chairs in that manner. And so our team, we would go through each one of the rows of chairs, and we were praying for each other. And because it was a home, everything was a little bit tight. And I remember praying over one person, and I'm telling you, the heat of God was so on me. I really felt like I had a fever. I mean, and so my hands were on fire, and I'm praying, and all of a sudden, I felt this very hot. I'm not sure if you got what you guys call it here. We call it in America, we call it a poker. It's the thing that you stoke the wood with, right? The metal iron thing that you poke the wood with to get the fire stirred up, you know. And so I felt in my back hitting me like this sharp point of this instrument, of this poker, and I was like, who in the world's poking me with a fiery poker? You know, and I looked behind me, and one of our other team members that was praying, her elbow kept hitting my back as she's moving and praying for people, and every time her elbow would hit me, the heat and the power and the presence of God was so powerful over her that it felt like a searing poker on my back. This is how God, when He manifests His presence, the fiery presence of God, the amazing, powerful anointings and transformations occur. I can't tell you the number of stories of what we've heard of transformations that came out of those specific meetings. So it's very important that we keep that fire burning. Tips to keep the fire, to keep the flame. I'll give you guys an example. In the Olympics, they have the Olympic torch, and the idea is they set the torch from a specific source, and then the runner will take the torch, and they will run various locations in the routes, the Olympic route. I'm not sure of all the different routes that they've done over the years. But the idea is they hand the torch off to different individuals as they run the race. And as they're running the race, they want to make sure that they do not have the flame go out. So it's interesting that for the Olympics, that they have a group of engineers that look at the torch, and they go through all kinds of tests to make sure the flame doesn't go out. So some of the things that they do. Well, one thing they do is they test it in a wind tunnel. They make sure that they put the flame in the wind tunnel, and they blow air across it. And so even through the winds of the pressures of life as they blow, they're testing, in this case, physically, making sure the flame doesn't go out. If we look at the spiritual aspects of it, we want our flame to be in such a way that as the storms and the winds of life begin to blow through us, that it won't snuff our flame out. It's said that one set of engineers, they actually didn't have a wind tunnel. They were testing it in Mexico, and they didn't have a wind tunnel to test the torch with. So they literally got in a car, put the torch outside the window, and drove at a high rate of speed down the road in Mexico to make sure that they weren't going to extinguish the flame due to the high wind. Another tip for keeping the flame burning bright and not letting it go out is to ensure that the flame has enough oil. That's one thing that the Olympic teams, as they're preparing for the Olympic Games, they make sure that they have enough fuel on hand, enough oil to keep that flame burning. And in most cases, it's olive oil, believe it or not. And so the same with us, that the oil of the Holy Spirit will continue to be released, and to let the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. If you feel like you're dry, you feel like that your flame is about to go out, I encourage you guys to find where Holy Spirit is moving in those services, in those conferences, to where you can allow the Holy Spirit to pour Himself out in a greater way. They have backup torches that are lit along the way. In the Olympic Games, you don't see it, but they actually have backup torches that have been ignited from the same source, so that if for some reason the flame gets low, or it literally gets blown out for some reason, the backup flame can immediately reignite it, and allow the runner to continue with the torch on fire. That's representative of many of us as believers. As our flame is getting low, it's important for us to have others around us that have the flaming, fiery presence of God to reignite you when you're getting low, when you're getting weak. From another flame from the same source, which is the God of heaven. Another way to keep the flame burning is to test the flame in torrential downpours. So they literally will go out into torrential downpours to make sure that flame doesn't get snuffed out in the rain. They found a trick on this. Keep the flame hotter than the surrounding conditions. In your life, if you keep your flame of your fiery flame of the presence of God hotter than the conditions around you, you won't be risk of it going out. That's a tip to keep the flame burning hot. So, for 100 years, the Cherokee Nation kept a sacred flame burning until 1830. So they focused on the fire. They didn't want the fire to go out because that was their way of warmth. That was their way that they cooked. So they had this single fire that they never let it go out. Many of you guys, if you've ever been camping and you stay overnight, it's very important for you to keep that fire and keep those embers. Someone might have to get up in the middle of the night and put more fuel on the fire to make sure that it doesn't go out. And in the same way, the Cherokee Nation did that for over 100 years, keeping that sacred fire burning. Until 1830, that sacred fire was in the same location. It was in the eastern part of the United States. But in 1830, the U.S. government, they forced the Cherokee Nation to move from their homeland out into the plains of Oklahoma, into a strange and foreign land, just as many other nations have done over history, where they come in and they take over and they send those out to exile. And in this particular case, the Cherokee Nation was literally being driven across the United States into the Oklahoma region, into exile. And during that time, it's commonly known in our country as the Trail of Tears, because as the Cherokee Nation began to move from the eastern part of the United States out into the western regions, there were numbers of people that died and passed away. And before they left, they make sure they ignited and got some embers from the original fire source there in a Red Clay Park, there in the eastern part of the United States. As they moved forward, and they ended up in Oklahoma, they kept the embers burning and they reignited the fire in Oklahoma, and they kept the fire burning all that time from 1830 until 1984. And in 1984, there was some reconciliation between the U.S. government and the Cherokee Nation, and they brought the eternal flame back from Oklahoma to reignite it and to bring it back to its original location in the area near Cleveland, Tennessee. This is this is an example of where how far are you and myself, how far are we willing to go to keep our fire burning? How far are we willing to go? What will we do to keep to keep those embers ablaze, to keep them on fire? It says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 14, Paul recognizes the importance of keeping that flame, that fiery presence of God burning. And in verse 14, he says, I press on to the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenwardly in Christ Jesus. It's his call and it's his heart that he presses forward and he does everything he can to keep that flame burning, to keep the fiery presence of God. To summarize, I've given you guys some tips on that to keep the fire burning. Make sure that it's tested in the wind. What are you doing to ensure that the fire flames will keep stoked? it's important to ensure that even in the winds of your life, that the fiery presence of God doesn't go out. Ensure that the oil, the Holy Spirit, the presence of God is plentiful in your life. And if not, put yourself in a place to where you can be refilled with the Holy Spirit. Constantly being filled, because you want that flame to continuously remain. And also remember that there are others around you. If your flame is starting to dwindle, is starting to go out, get around those that are on fire for God, that have His heart and have His presence. Seek them out. If you have to, go to another region, to a revival or to a conference, but stoke the fire. That's what the Lord is desiring for us, to keep the flame burning continuously. Have a great day.